After dedicating 29 years to her company, Melody Reynolds was fired just 3 days before her pension fully vested. What her boss didn't expect was that the quiet, meticulous compliance officer had been documenting every unethical move. Instead of walking away in silence, she made a single phone call that shook the entire company to its core. Melody Reynolds had always been the backbone of compliance at GRW Manufacturing. For nearly 3 decades, she ensured that policies were followed, regulations were respected, and ethical lines were never crossed. Her work was not glamorous, but it was essential. She never sought recognition, only the satisfaction of knowing she was doing the right thing. That was what made the Friday afternoon meeting so unusual. When she was called into the director's office, a sleek corner space with glass walls and modern furnishings, her instincts told her something was wrong. The manila folder sitting neatly on David Langston's polished desk confirmed it. His voice was calm and controlled as he announced, "Due to budget constraints, we are letting you go. Effective immediately." Melody remained still. Her mind registered the shock, but she kept her composure. She had been with the company for 29 years and 362 days. Her pension was set to fully vest in exactly 3 days. It was not an unfortunate coincidence. It was a strategic decision made to cut costs and save the company money. Cold. Calculated. She picked up the folder, choosing not to open it. David expected emotion, maybe anger or disbelief. But Melody gave him none of that. She simply stood, thanked him, and walked out with grace. Janet from Human Resources stood silently nearby, looking uneasy as she followed Melody to her office. She gathered her personal items quietly, a framed picture of her late husband, a small potted plant her daughter had given her years ago, and a 25-year service award. It was not much, but what truly mattered could not be placed in a cardboard box. As Melody drove through the wet streets of St. Paul, her thoughts turned to the countless nights she had worked late. She remembered the school events she missed, the weekends she had given up, the emergencies she had resolved while others went home. For her, the job was never just a paycheck. It had been a mission of integrity and consistency. She had believed that her efforts would be rewarded with stability when it was time to retire. Now, with the rain streaking across her windshield and her phone buzzing unanswered in the passenger seat, she let the truth settle. They had discarded her. But what they had forgotten was that Melody Reynolds did not forget. She documented. She kept records. And this time the story would be told. Melody sat at her kitchen table, her tea cooling beside the unopened severance folder. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft ticking of a wall clock and the distant patter of rain against the windows. She finally reached for the envelope and slowly pulled out the documents. The offer was as insulting as she had feared. 3 months' salary in exchange for a signature that would waive all future claims against the company. No pension. No healthcare continuation. No recognition for nearly 3 decades of service. Just a signature. A trap disguised as mercy. Melody placed the papers aside and stood. Her calm was no longer about shock. It was about clarity. She walked to her home office and opened a drawer that had remained locked for years. Inside, she pulled out a fireproof box buried beneath photo albums and holiday cards. Clicked open easily. Neatly organized within were hundreds of pages of records. Emails, memos, financial documents, notes she had written in margins. These were not collected out of paranoia. They were the quiet work of someone who had always known that being thorough might one day matter. There were loan applications with inflated numbers, backdated quality control documents, correspondence suggesting deliberate delays in reporting losses, and most recently, cost-cutting measures that would have compromised safety protocols. Melody had submitted every concern through internal channels. All had been ignored. Now she had more than memories. She had evidence. She reached for her phone and scrolled to a contact she had not used in years. Gregory Santos had once been the chief financial officer at GRW Manufacturing. Now, he worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had always respected her meticulous work ethic, even when others found it excessive. She dialed. When his familiar voice answered, she introduced herself and explained briefly. Gregory listened in silence, then asked the question she had been waiting for. "Do you still have the documents?" "Yes," she said. "I have everything." "Then we need to meet." After she hung up, Melody felt a quiet power settle inside her chest. For the first time in a long while, she was not just reacting. She was choosing. The company had spent years underestimating her. They had dismissed her warnings, ignored her memos, and finally pushed her out when she became inconvenient. They had forgotten the first rule of compliance. The paper trail always leads somewhere. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy stillness. Melody woke up before the sun and brewed a cup of her favorite Earl Grey tea, letting the steam rise gently as she stared out her kitchen window. In the distance, the early morning fog hung low over the rooftops, mirroring the haze of thoughts drifting through her mind. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by a growing stack of evidence. Over the past 24 hours, she had meticulously organized each document into labeled folders. Her habit of careful record-keeping, once teased by coworkers, had become her greatest asset. It was no longer just a personal archive. It was a legal arsenal. She created 3 full sets of everything. One for herself, one for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and one additional copy in case of emergency. She placed them in waterproof envelopes, sealed them, and stored each in a separate location. She also backed up her digital files onto encrypted drives. She did not want any possibility of these records disappearing. As the clock struck 9, her phone began to ring. First it was Janet from Human Resources, then David Langston, then the company's legal representative. Each call went unanswered. She listened to the voicemails instead. Their tone had shifted. What began as polite requests had turned into veiled warnings. They urged her to sign the severance agreement before the deadline. One message even hinted at legal consequences if she failed to respond. By late afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside her home. Melody watched from behind her curtains as David Langston stepped out, dressed sharply as always, holding a thin envelope in one hand. He rang the doorbell, waited for a moment, then placed the envelope in her mailbox and left. Inside was another copy of the severance agreement. This one came with a handwritten note that read, "Final opportunity. Return signed copy by 9 in the morning." Melody folded the paper neatly and returned it to the envelope without a word. She then walked to her study, opened her lockbox and confirmed everything was still in place. Tomorrow, she would not return to her former office. Instead, she would walk into the offices of the federal regulators with 3 decades of truth. She was no longer afraid. She was prepared. Monday morning arrived crisp and cold. The sky outside Melody's window brushed in soft shades of steel gray. She dressed with quiet determination, choosing the navy blue suit she had always worn for important meetings. Her briefcase, heavy with carefully prepared documents, sat by the door. It was time. She drove through the quiet streets of St. Paul, past the landmarks that had shaped her adult life. The cathedral where she had exchanged vows with Thomas. The elementary school where Elizabeth had performed in school plays. The office building she had walked into 5 days a week for nearly 3 decades. But today, her destination was different. At exactly 8:30, Melody stepped into the federal building where her former colleague Gregory now worked with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He met her at the entrance, his face serious but kind. They moved to a glass-walled conference room where 2 other professionals were waiting. Angela, a senior enforcement attorney, and James, a forensic accountant. They greeted her with quiet professionalism and offered her a glass of water. Once seated, Melody opened her briefcase and began. For over 3 hours, she presented her findings. She walked the investigators through years of irregular reporting, questionable approvals, and executive-level directives that violated both ethical standards and legal expectations. Every figure had been double-checked. Every document had a clear trail. Her words were calm, focused, and deliberate. Angela listened carefully, asking pointed questions. James took notes while scanning the records, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. Gregory barely spoke, allowing Melody to hold the room. When she finished, Angela leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "What you have shown us is not just documentation of internal mismanagement. This points to a pattern of fraud that could carry serious consequences. We will begin a formal investigation immediately. I want to thank you for your courage and thoroughness." Melody nodded, her expression calm. It was no longer about emotion. It was about facts. She had spent her life upholding rules that others tried to bend. Now those rules would stand for her. As she exited the building and stepped into the chilled spring air, her phone buzzed. It was Janet from Human Resources. The board has called an emergency meeting. There are whispers about Langston being locked in his office. What did you do? Melody looked at the horizon and answered truthfully. I did the right thing. Melody returned home that afternoon to a flurry of voicemails and messages. The atmosphere around Grantwell Manufacturing had shifted dramatically in just a few hours. Her quiet departure the previous Friday had been nothing more than a spark, but now it had become a blaze that no one could ignore. The board's emergency meeting had not gone unnoticed. Janet's whispered updates continued throughout the day. Langston's office door remained closed for most of the morning. The general counsel looked pale when he exited the conference room. Rumors circulated that external legal advisors had been called in. By early evening, Melody received an official email from the company's legal department. Her termination had been rescinded. She was now placed on administrative leave with full benefits, pending internal review. It was a weak attempt to regain control, and she saw through it instantly. The reversal was not an apology. It was damage control. That night, Melody sat at her kitchen table, staring at the message. She took a deep breath, then sent a brief but formal reply, copying her attorney and the SEC contacts. I acknowledge receipt of your message. I will not engage in any further communication without legal representation. Any decisions regarding my status must go through the proper legal channels. She closed her laptop and poured herself a cup of tea. The warm steam rose slowly, curling through the air like a gentle reminder to stay centered. The next morning brought more news. A well-respected business publication had run a story about a whistleblower at Grantwell. Though the article did not mention her by name, the details left little doubt. A longtime employee had provided evidence of fraudulent activity and had been terminated just days before her pension was set to fully vest. The phone rang again. This time it was the chairman of the board. Miss Reynolds, he said, his tone unusually cautious. We would like to speak with you directly. There are matters that require your input. Melody paused before answering. Any future conversations will include my attorney and may be subject to regulatory oversight. There was silence on the other end. Very well, the chairman said. We will arrange something more formal. Melody ended the call, her voice unwavering, her heart steady. For nearly 3 decades, she had protected the company's integrity. Now she would protect her own. The morning of the formal meeting arrived under a blanket of soft April rain. Melody stood outside the tall glass building that once represented years of dedication and professional pride. Today it was just a symbol of betrayal. Her attorney, Barbara Reynolds, met her at the entrance. The two women shared a quiet nod before entering together. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with tension. Several members of the board were present, along with Grantwell's external legal counsel. The interim CEO, Patricia Donovan, sat at the head of the table. David Langston was notably absent. Patricia offered a thin smile. Thank you for joining us, Miss Reynolds. We understand this is a delicate situation, and we appreciate your cooperation. Barbara's voice was calm but firm. Let us be very clear. Miss Reynolds is here as a professional courtesy. Her cooperation is contingent on transparency and respect. This is not an informal chat. Patricia nodded. Of course. Let us begin. The next hour was filled with carefully worded statements from the board members. They expressed shock at the allegations. They distanced themselves from David's decisions. They praised Melody's long service. And they insisted that her termination had been a mistake, a decision made without full understanding of the circumstances. Melody listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When it was her turn to speak, she placed a folder on the table. Inside was a chronological summary of the memos, emails, and internal reports she had submitted over the years. 47 major reports, 16 memos to executive leadership, 9 meeting requests. Only 2 had been granted. She spoke without anger, only clarity. At every step I followed protocol. I raised concerns. I documented issues. I asked for help. Each time I was ignored. A heavy silence filled the room. For the first time, the board members saw Melody not as a compliance officer, but as a witness to years of corporate negligence. Patricia folded her hands. We would like to make this right, Miss Reynolds. Your pension will be fully honored. Your employment status has been restored retroactively. We are prepared to offer a formal apology and additional compensation. Melody's attorney raised a hand. We are not making decisions today. We expect your full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, and we will be watching closely. The meeting ended with firm handshakes and tired faces. As Melody and Barbara exited the building, Barbara turned and whispered, "They finally see you, Melody. And they are afraid." Melody nodded. They should be. The days that followed were a whirlwind of news reports, legal updates, and whispered phone calls. By Wednesday morning, the headlines were unavoidable. Major media outlets had picked up the story. Grantwell faces federal probe was printed across newspapers and digital platforms alike. The company's stock fell sharply. Investors demanded answers, and the public began asking difficult questions. Melody remained composed. She avoided interviews, stayed away from social media, and focused solely on the process. Every morning, she met with SEC investigators to review evidence and clarify timelines. Gregory kept her updated on the broader investigation. He called her one afternoon with news that shifted everything. "It is worse than we thought," he said quietly. "The fraudulent accounting practices began years before David arrived. He simply expanded them." Melody closed her eyes. She had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed made the betrayal deeper. She had dedicated her career to protecting a company that had never protected her in return. 3 board members have resigned, Gregory continued. David is officially under criminal investigation. His statements to the press did not help him. Melody had read the interviews. David had painted her as bitter and unstable, suggesting that her termination was performance-related. The company quickly corrected the record, but the damage to his credibility had already been done. That weekend, Melody received a call from Patricia Donovan. The interim CEO's voice was more direct this time. "Miss Reynolds, the board would like to meet with you again. We have revised our proposal." Melody agreed to meet, but only at her attorney's office. When Patricia arrived, she brought with her a formal letter of apology, confirmation of full pension restoration, and an additional 5-year compensation package. It included healthcare coverage for life and a request. "We are creating a new corporate ethics division," Patricia said. "We want you to help build it. Your experience, your integrity, your persistence. We need that now." Melody sat silently for a moment. She looked down at the letter in her hand. For so long she had asked for accountability. Now they were finally offering it. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly, "but I will have to think about it." "Of course," Patricia replied. "Take your time." As Patricia left, Melody remained seated in her attorney's office, the document still in her hands. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. Not because the battle was over, but because the truth was no longer hidden. Monday arrived with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. For the first time in weeks, Melody did not have a meeting on her calendar or a legal document to review. She sat on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the lake shimmer in the morning light. It was the first peaceful moment she had allowed herself since the day she had been dismissed from the company she had served for nearly 3 decades. That peace was interrupted by a call from Gregory. "The investigation is moving faster than expected," he said. "The evidence you provided opened a trail we had not even anticipated. More executives are being called in. And Melody, they are not denying it anymore." Melody felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the company she had once believed in. Relief that justice was no longer theoretical but happening in real time. That afternoon, she received a formal letter from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It thanked her for her cooperation and officially recognized her as a whistleblower. Enclosed was documentation confirming her eligibility for a financial award equal to a percentage of the penalties imposed on the company. Melody was quiet as she read the letter. It was not about the money. It never had been. It was about knowing she had stood up when it mattered. That her voice had broken through the silence that too often surrounds corporate misconduct. Later that week, she met with her daughter Elizabeth and her 2 grandchildren at the lake. They baked cookies, painted small birdhouses, and spent an afternoon feeding ducks along the shoreline. As the sun began to set, Elizabeth sat beside her mother on the porch swing. You did something incredible, she said softly. You stood up to all of them. You protected something bigger than just your own rights. You showed me what strength looks like. Melody smiled. For years, she had thought her impact was confined to conference rooms, audit reports, and compliance reviews. But now she saw it more clearly. Her choices had rippled beyond the company and into the lives of those she loved most. That evening, she opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote a single sentence. Integrity is not a role. It is a decision you make every day. She closed the notebook and exhaled. The fight was not yet over. There would be more headlines, more hearings, and perhaps more late-night phone calls from lawyers and reporters. But for the first time in her life, Melody knew exactly who she was. And she was not afraid anymore. Weeks passed, and the world slowly moved on from the headlines. The scandal at Grant-Well Manufacturing faded from the front pages, but the reforms it triggered began to take root. New compliance protocols were introduced across multiple companies in the industry, modeled after the documentation Melody had maintained so diligently. Whistleblower protections were expanded, and her name was quietly cited in internal training sessions as a case study in ethical courage. Melody did not seek the spotlight. She declined interviews, turned down speaking invitations, and refused lucrative offers to publish a memoir. Instead, she focused on what mattered to her most. She used part of her whistleblower reward to start a foundation in her late husband's name, dedicated to mentoring young women, entering the fields of corporate compliance and financial ethics. The first scholarship was awarded to a young woman who had once been told she was too meticulous to lead. Melody met her in person. They spoke for hours. I do not want to be feared, Melody told her. I want to be remembered as someone who chose truth when it mattered. You can do that too. You will. Just remember, your quiet voice is powerful when it speaks the truth. At home, life had returned to a gentle rhythm. Mornings by the lake, afternoons tending her garden, evenings filled with laughter from her grandchildren. Her daughter Elizabeth often joined her for long walks, and together they found joy in the simple peace that had been so long delayed. One night, under a sky full of stars, Elizabeth asked softly, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you had just signed the papers?" Melody looked at her and smiled. "Sometimes," she replied. "But then I remember that silence is a choice. And so is courage." As they stood side by side looking out at the moonlit water, Melody felt no bitterness, no regret. Just quiet pride. She had done what was right, and the world was better for it.